The champagne glass shattered against the marble before I even registered that she'd thrown it. It wasn't aimed at me, not exactly. It hit the floor a foot to my left, but the message landed exactly where she wanted it to. The room went silent except for the string ensemble in the corner, who kept playing for 3 more agonizing seconds before someone finally signaled them to stop. 60-some faces turned toward us. I felt my pulse in my throat. And then Constance Sorrell looked at me with the kind of contempt you usually only see directed at something stuck to the bottom of a shoe, and said, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear, "You will not humiliate this family with your little schemes." That was the night I texted my mother one word. That was the night everything I thought I understood about the next 40 years of my life came apart in under 10 minutes. But to understand why a 61-year-old woman in head-to-toe Oscar de la Renta would throw a glass of champagne at her son's fiancée in the middle of a country club ballroom in Greenwich, Connecticut, you need to understand what the 5 months before that night actually looked like. You need to understand who I was before I became the woman standing there with champagne soaking into the hem of a $1,400 dress, trying very hard not to cry in front of people who were already filming. My name is Meredith Lang. I'm 33 years old. I'm a corporate tax attorney at a mid-sized firm in Stamford. And before you decide that sounds boring, I'll just say this. Tax law is where rich families hide things, and I have spent 8 years learning exactly where to look. I made partner track 2 years ago. I bought my own condo in South Norwalk with money I earned, not money anyone gave me. I drive a 6-year-old Honda CR-V that I keep meticulously maintained, because I don't believe in car payments. And I have never once in my adult life asked anyone for help with rent. I'm telling you all of this upfront because it matters for what comes later. It matters because Constance Sorrell spent 5 months deciding I was a gold digger before she ever bothered to learn a single true fact about me. Let me take you back to a Tuesday morning in late September. Back when my biggest problem was a client who wanted to restructure his trust in a way that was, generously speaking, aggressive with the IRS. Back when I thought my life was settling into exactly the shape I wanted. I'd been with Nathan Sorrell for 2.5 years. We met at a continuing legal education conference, of all places. He's a litigator, corporate disputes mostly, and we ended up at the same overpriced hotel bar comparing notes on which speaker had clearly never actually tried a case. He was 38, divorced once, no kids, with the kind of calm I'd later realize wasn't actually calm so much as a very practiced ability to avoid conflict by simply not engaging with it. We moved slowly. I'd been burned before by men who liked the idea of dating a lawyer more than they liked dating me specifically, and Nathan seemed different. Patient, steady, genuinely interested in the cases I couldn't talk about and the ones I could. We dated for over a year before he introduced me to his mother. That should have told me something. I know that now. At the time, I told myself it was just because they weren't close, which was sort of true, and sort of a very convenient story Nathan had let me believe. My life back then was genuinely good. And I want to be clear that I don't say that lightly, because the version of good I'd built was hard-won. I grew up in Albany, the daughter of a high school guidance counselor and a man who installed hook systems for 30 years before he retired with a bad back and a pension he'd fought the union for. We weren't poor, but money was something you respected, not something that flowed. I went to a state school on scholarships and loans, worked through law school doing contract review at 2 in the morning, and clawed my way into a firm that actually paid associates a living wage. I had a 1-bedroom condo I'd put a real down payment on, and a tabby cat named Brief. Yes, like a legal brief. My law school humor never really left me. On Tuesday mornings, I made coffee in my kitchen while Nathan read briefs on his laptop at my counter, still in the t-shirt he'd slept in. And the early light coming through my window made the whole apartment look like it had been dipped in honey. That particular Tuesday, he looked up and said, "Mom wants to do dinner Sunday." I set my mug down carefully. I'd met Constance exactly once at that point, 8 months into dating her son, a brief lunch that had lasted 90 minutes and felt like 4 hours. She'd asked me, within the first 6 minutes of sitting down, what my parents did for a living. When I told her, she'd smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "How resourceful of you, getting all the way to law school from that," like I'd pulled off some kind of magic trick instead of simply doing the work. Is this a regular thing now? I asked, or a specific thing? Nathan did the thing he did when he was being slightly evasive without technically lying. She wants to spend more time with you, he said. We've been together a while. I think she's coming around. I said okay. I told myself difficult future mothers-in-law were practically a universal experience. That I had negotiated worse personalities across a conference table and won. And that I was being paranoid about a woman who was probably just protective of her only son. What I didn't know, what Nathan had conveniently failed to mention, was that he was planning to propose at that dinner. He did it over dessert in the dining room of the Sorrel House in Greenwich. An actual 10,000 square foot Georgian colonial with a circular driveway and a name for the property. Thornfield, like it was a hotel, with Constance and Nathan's stepfather Gerald watching from across the table. Gerald was a quiet, pleasant man who I'd later understand had survived 20 years of marriage to Constance by simply never having opinions she hadn't already approved of. Nathan got down on one knee, said the things you say, and I said yes, and I meant it completely. I was 33. I had been deliberate and careful in choosing this relationship in a way I hadn't been in my 20s, and I loved him. Constance hugged me. She said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart," in a voice warm enough that I actually believed it for about 6 weeks. It was a performance. I understand that now. At the time, I thought it was a beginning. The shift was subtle at first. A comment at Thanksgiving, which we spent at Thornfield because Constance had already planned the menu before anyone asked my preference. About how she'd always pictured Nathan's wedding at the club. The same club her own mother had been a member of, the same club where, eventually, she would throw a glass of champagne at my head. Not aggressive, just a stone dropped in still water, watching the ripples. I said something non-committal about how Nathan and I hadn't really discussed venues yet. She said, of course, and moved on. Like she hadn't just informed me my wedding had already been planned without me. Then there was Christmas. When she mentioned to Nathan's cousin, in a tone perfectly calibrated to sound like a compliment, that I did contract work for some firm in Stamford. Not partner-track corporate tax law. Not 8 years of expertise. Just contract work, like I freelanced spreadsheets from my kitchen table. The cousin looked at me with the specific suburban pity of someone who'd just been told I needed it. Nathan, standing right there, did not correct his mother. I brought it up in the car on the drive home. She made it sound like I do gig work, I said. She doesn't really understand what tax attorneys do, Nathan said. She asked me what my parents did for a living the first time we ever spoke, I said. She understands exactly what she's asking. He got quiet. That was a pattern with Nathan. He went quiet when he didn't want to agree with you but couldn't find the nerve to disagree either. I'd been reading that quiet as thoughtfulness. I was starting to recalibrate by February, cold and gray in the particular way that makes you reconsider every life choice that led you to the Northeast. Constance had twice suggested, with that same unbothered smile, that perhaps I was very career-focused for someone who wanted a family. Had mentioned once that Nathan's ex-wife had been wonderful at homemaking. And had asked me at a dinner, where I was the only person who'd actually finished the overcooked salmon, whether my father was still working or retired. I answered evenly. I said my father was retired. What I didn't add, because it was none of her business and because I refused to perform my family's worth for anyone, was the rest of it. My father, Thomas Lang, had spent 31 years running his own HVAC and mechanical contracting business out of Albany. He started with 2 employees and a used van. And by the time he sold the company 18 months ago, it had built and maintained climate systems for half the commercial buildings in the capital region, including, as it happens, several properties owned by a real estate trust that I would later discover Constance Sorrell sat on the board of, though I didn't know that yet. He sold the business for just north of $6 million. He still wears the same 5 flannel shirts in rotation. He still calls his old crew by their first names and remembers their kids' birthdays. He's the most quietly competent person I've ever known, and I'd made the deliberate choice not to tell Constance any of it, because it felt like a test I refused to take on her terms. I wasn't going to buy my way into her approval. I wanted her to respect me or not, based on who I actually was. The engagement party was her idea, obviously. The 3rd Saturday in March, At the old Greenwich Country Club, the same club with the name plaque in the lobby that includes her family's name twice, across 2 generations. She picked the date. She picked the venue. She picked the caterer, the florist, and the guest list of roughly 70 people, most of whom I had never met in my life. When I gently asked whether Nathan and I might weigh in on anything, she looked at me with an expression of such serene, immovable confidence that I felt about 9 years old, asking permission to rearrange furniture in someone else's house. I should have known. Standing in that gravel parking lot in my navy dress, heels sinking slightly into the wet ground while Nathan held an umbrella over both of us, that I was about to walk into something I wasn't prepared for. The first hour was fine. Champagne, introductions, the specific exhaustion of being a woman everyone wants to evaluate without appearing to. I talked about the firm. I talked about the house Nathan and I were thinking of buying in Westport, a house I had somewhat ridiculously already mentally redesigned the kitchen of, because apparently lawyers do that too. I talked to Gerald, who was kind in a muted, apologetic way, and to Nathan's younger sister, Paige, who kept giving me looks across the room that I couldn't quite read. Something between sympathy and warning. And then Constance pulled me aside. She steered me by the elbow toward the coat check hallway, away from the main room, her grip firmer than I expected from a woman in heels that thin. She smelled like Chanel No. 5, which felt almost too on the nose. I want to discuss something with you, she said, before this goes any further. Of course, I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that, even then. I've had some people look into things, she said. A pause, deliberate. Into your situation. My stomach dropped. Not because I had anything to hide, but because the careful, rehearsed calm in her voice told me she believed she'd found something. Preston called me, she said. There it was. The floor felt like it tilted. Preston Marlowe, my law school friend, and for the last 3 years, the managing partner I reported to at the firm. Preston, who had access to my client files, my billing records, every confidential filing I'd touched. He told me some very interesting things, Constance said. Her tone perfectly pleasant, the way a scalpel is perfectly precise. Irregularities in your conduct at the firm. Conflicts of interest. He's quite concerned for you, actually, and frankly, so am I. My son is about to marry into this. I have a right to understand what I'm looking at. I'm sorry, I said. Preston called you? He's worried, she said. And he should be. He told me you've been advising a client on structuring assets in a way that he believes crosses a serious ethical line. That there may be a bar complaint coming. He said you've been careless, Meredith, and that it could become a real problem for you. And for this family by extension. I felt the cold, narrowing clarity that comes right before anger turns into something controlled and useful. Whatever Preston told you, I said, I'd like to hear it from him directly. Because I'm not aware of any ethical violations in my work, none. She looked at me for a long moment. And then she said it anyway, with that same smile. He said you've been signing off on filings without proper review. That you've been taking shortcuts with a major client because you wanted the billable hours. That there's an internal review starting. It landed like something physical, because it was a lie. A complete, constructed, deliberate lie. And because in that single second, I understood, with total clarity, exactly why Preston would tell it, I didn't get the chance to respond. Because that was the moment Nathan walked over, holding 2 glasses of champagne. And the look on his face told me, in the specific way you can read someone you've loved for 2.5 years, that he'd caught at least the tail end of what his mother had just said. Constance looked at her son, then back at me, and said, loud enough that the 4 or 5 people nearest us went still. I will not let some scheming little climber drag this family's name through an ethics scandal. And then she threw the champagne. It missed me. It hit the floor. But the room reacted as though it hadn't, as though the gesture itself was the slap, and in every way that mattered, it was. The quartet kept playing for 3 confused seconds and then stopped. Phones came out before I'd even fully processed what had happened. I stood there with champagne fizzing against the marble near my shoes, my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with alcohol. And I made a decision that was the clearest thing I'd felt in months. I walked to the coat check. I got my coat. I walked out the front doors into a fine, cold drizzle, and I stood on the stone steps of the old Greenwich Country Club, and I texted my mother one word. Cam. She called back in 11 seconds. My mother, Carol Lang, 29 years as a high school guidance counselor, does not panic. Ever. Not in front of teenagers in crisis, and not in front of me. Double quotes where? She said, not really a question. A coordinate request. Old Greenwich Country Club, front entrance. I'm calling your father. 40 minutes, she said. Go back inside somewhere warm. Don't talk to anyone. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need the story yet. That was my mother in a single exchange. Assess, deploy, explain later. I had watched both my parents operate that way my entire life, in different registers. And I had never been more grateful for it than I was on those wet stone steps. With my pulse still hammering in my ears, I went back inside, not to the ballroom, but to a small empty sitting room near the coat check that nobody was using. And I sat down and called Preston's actual phone number, the direct line, not the front desk. He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. Then I called Anjali Rao, my closest friend from law school, who now does white-collar defense work and who picks up her phone at any hour without ever sounding annoyed about it. I told her everything in about 4 minutes. Constance, the accusation, Preston's name. Meredith, listen to me, Anjali said. Has Preston had access to your client files recently? Anything you've flagged as sensitive? He's the managing partner. He has access to everything. Then I want you to log in right now, tonight, and pull your activity log on the Ashcombe Capital file. Screenshot everything. Every access entry, every download, every login that isn't yours. You think he's setting something up. I think a managing partner who called your fiancée's mother with a fabricated ethics complaint about you has already decided to do something, Anjali said. I don't know what yet. Document it before Monday. I spent the next 40 minutes in that sitting room doing exactly that, my hand steadier than I expected, the shock burning off into something colder and more useful. What I found confirmed exactly what I'd started to suspect the second Preston's name left Constance's mouth. Ashcombe Capital was my biggest client. A family office I'd brought into the firm myself 2 years earlier, worth roughly $400 million in managed assets. The kind of relationship that builds a partner's entire career. The access log showed 3 logins to the Ashcombe file from Preston's credentials over the past 2 weeks. All after hours. All outside any matter he was assigned to. And buried in the document history, a draft engagement letter. Not mine. Proposing that Preston personally take over as lead counsel on the account, citing performance concerns with the current attorney of record. He wasn't reporting an ethics violation. He was manufacturing one, to take my client. I sent Anjali the screenshots. All 31 of them. She texted back 4 minutes later. You're going to be fine. Say nothing to anyone tonight. Your parents coming. Yes, I wrote back. Good, she wrote. Then don't let her see you shake. I heard the shift in the ballroom before I saw it. The quartet had stopped again. Voices dropping into that particular register a room gets when something is happening that everyone wants to watch without admitting they're watching. I stood up and looked around the corner. My parents arrived in 36 minutes. I don't know how my father drove that fast from Albany. He hadn't, of course. He'd been in Manhattan that weekend for a Contractors Association dinner, which made the timing almost merciful. But there they were. My father, Thomas, in a sport coat over a flannel shirt, because that's as dressed up as he gets. And my mother in the navy wrap dress she keeps in her overnight bag for exactly this kind of emergency. The kind of preparedness that comes from decades of intercepting other people's crises for a living. They had not come alone. My father had brought Harold Kingsley, the family's longtime business attorney, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had structured my father's company sale, and who, I would learn that night, had also done quiet legal work for a property trust connected to several Greenwich families, including, as it turned out, the very real estate trust Constance Sorrell sat on. The other man was someone I didn't recognize at first, and then did. Gordon Reyes, my father's longtime banking relationship manager from a regional commercial bank, who had personally underwritten financing for 2 of my father's biggest contracts, and who had apparently dropped his Saturday night plans without complaint, Constance was moving toward them before they'd fully crossed the lobby. The set of her shoulders pure managerial confidence, clearly assuming these were uninvited strangers to be politely removed. "I'm sorry," she said, in her most controlled hostess voice. "This is a private event." My father looked at her without any particular expression. "You're Constance Sorrell," he said. Not a question. Something in his tone made her stop moving entirely. "I'm Thomas Lang," he said. "Meredith's father." A beat. "I think we have some things to discuss." I walked into the room. Then I watched Nathan see me, watched him register my parents, and Harold and Gordon, watched something shift behind his eyes I couldn't fully read yet. Paige was standing near the bar with an expression that looked almost relieved, which I filed away for later. Nathan came toward me first. "Meredith, I'm so sorry." What she said, what she did. I should have, "Not right now," I said, without cruelty. Because I genuinely didn't have it in me for that conversation in the next 10 minutes. My father, Harold, and Constance drifted toward the windows on the far side of the room. Gerald materialized beside his wife the way he always did, present, quiet, a half step behind. I moved to stand next to my father. Constance looked at the three of us and visibly recalculated. "I don't know what Meredith has told you," she said. "But I was simply protecting my son's interests." Harold said, "Mrs. Sorrell, I'm going to stop you there." He opened a leather portfolio and set several printed pages on the nearest cocktail table with the unhurried precision of a man who'd done this before. "These are activity logs, pulled tonight from Meredith's firm, documenting unauthorized access to a confidential client file by a managing partner named Preston Marlowe, along with a draft engagement letter attempting to reassign that client to himself under false pretenses." The room had gone quiet. Not entirely, but the 15 or so people nearest us had stopped pretending otherwise. "That's not," Constance started. "Preston Marlowe called you tonight with a fabricated story," my father said, his voice almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "He is, as of about 40 minutes ago, in the process of trying to steal your future daughter-in-law's biggest client. He needed a cover story to discredit her first, and he handed it to you. And you used it." He looked at her with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who'd spent 3 decades negotiating with difficult contractors and had run entirely out of patience for theater. "You threw a glass of champagne at my daughter. In front of 70 people." Constance opened her mouth and closed it again. Gordon Reyes spoke, up from slightly behind my father. "I can confirm part of this independently," he said. "Ashcombe Capital's family office uses our bank for several accounts. We flagged an unusual inquiry about reassigning signatory authority on Thursday. We were going to follow up Monday, but," he glanced at me, "given the circumstances." I looked directly at Constance. "I want you to hear this clearly," I said, keeping my voice level. A skill I'd been practicing since I was 22 and learned that losing your composure in a room full of powerful people is how you lose. "You called me a scheming climber in front of everyone you know. You implied I was facing an ethics investigation that doesn't exist. You threw a drink at me." I paused. "My billings last year were just under $1.1 million. I have no debt outside a mortgage I'm ahead on. My client roster includes a $400 million family office that I built from nothing." Another pause. "And my father built a $6 million company from a used van and 2 employees. You asked if he was still working. He sold the business 18 months ago. He just doesn't feel the need to announce that at dinner." Something moved across Constance's face. "Not remorse. I don't believe Constance Sorrell has ever fully experienced remorse in the way most people mean it. It was closer to recalibration, the specific dawning horror of a woman realizing she'd attacked the wrong target without confirming the terrain first, which, in her world, is the only true sin." Gerald put a hand on his wife's arm. "Constance," he said. "Just that." Harold said quietly, "My client will not be pursuing a civil claim for this all tonight, provided this evening ends without further incident, and provided you make no further contact with her or her firm. If those conditions aren't met, we'll be having a different conversation." He said it like a fact, not a threat, which somehow made it land harder. "Mom, you need to apologize," Nathan said. Now, Constance looked at her son, then at me. The certainty hadn't fully collapsed. People like Constance don't collapse. They reorganize. But it had cracked in the one place she'd clearly believed was untouchable. Meredith, she took a breath. I acted on information I now understand may have been, I said. Okay. I turned to Nathan. His face was doing something complicated. Guilt, grief, the early stages of having to reckon with exactly who his mother was and what it meant that he'd let her get this far. I'd loved that face for 2.5 years. I knew every register of it. I need you to answer one question, I said. Not about her. About you. Did you believe any of what she said, even for a second? He didn't answer right away, and that half-second of silence told me everything I needed to know about the next 6 months if I stayed. Okay, I said. I picked my coat up from the chair where I'd left it, kissed him once on the cheek because some part of me still meant it, and walked out with my parents and Harold and Gordon into the drizzle, which had turned to real rain by then. And I didn't look back. The drive to my parents' place in Albany was quiet for the first 20 minutes. My father drove the way he always drove, unhurried, both hands on the wheel, like the world owed him nothing and he wasn't in a rush to collect anyway. The rain came down steady against the windshield. Finally, my mother twisted around from the passenger seat. You doing okay back there? I will be, I said. Preston, my father said. Yeah, I said. Harold and I are going to put together a formal complaint to the State Bar Association first thing Monday, my father said. Along with whatever your firm's managing committee needs to open an internal review of his conduct. You want to handle this quietly, or do you want it on the record? I thought about 3 years building a client relationship from nothing. About the trust Ashcombe Capital had placed in me specifically, about the calculated, ugly way Preston had decided to burn it down and hand the match to my future mother-in-law because it was convenient. On the record, I said. My father nodded once. That was that. The process took about 10 weeks, and it wasn't pleasant, though it was cleaner than I expected. Preston had moved faster than anyone realized. He'd already started quietly contacting 2 other partners at Ashcombe Capital about transitioning the relationship before any of this happened, which the firm's internal review uncovered within days, once they actually looked. He resigned before the managing committee could vote on termination, which everyone understood was a distinction without a difference. The State Bar opened a formal inquiry into the unauthorized file access and the fabricated ethics narrative. That's still pending, but Anjali tells me it isn't looking good for him. I kept Ashcombe Capital. They sent flowers, actually, with a card that just said, "Heard what happened. Glad you're still ours." The firm made me full partner in May, 2 months ahead of schedule. In a quiet acknowledgement that nobody said out loud but everyone understood, Nathan and I ended the engagement 11 days after the party. It wasn't a screaming match. We sat in his apartment for almost 3 hours and talked, and what came out of it was honest and sad and, in the end, necessary. He loved his mother in the specific way people love someone who has made their entire world both smaller and safer at the same time, and he wasn't ready to stop doing that. Maybe someday he will be. I hope so, genuinely, for his sake. But I was 33 years old, and I had worked too long and built too much to spend the next several years waiting to find out whether he believed his mother's version of me, or the real one. I kept the ring for 4 days. Then I gave it back, because it was beautiful, and because I didn't want it sitting in a drawer reminding me of a night that ended with champagne on my shoes. Constance never apologized. Not really. Not in any way that reached past the surface. A note came through Harold 3 weeks later, to careful, lawyerly sentences expressing regret for any distress caused by a misunderstanding. I read it once, filed it, and haven't thought much about it since. Paige called me in April. "I want you to know I told him she was wrong," she said. "I told him before he proposed. Actually, I told him she'd find some way to make it about money or status or both." A pause. "I'm sorry he didn't listen sooner. Thank you for telling me that," I said. "It matters more than you'd think." It did. It still does. My father, for his part, never said "I told you so," because that has never once in his life been his style. What he did was show up at my condo the next weekend with a bag of the cat treats Brief likes and a casserole my mother had made. And he sat at my kitchen counter drinking coffee while I talked through the whole thing out loud for the first time, start to finish, and he listened the way he always listens. completely without an agenda, without trying to fix anything that wasn't actually broken. At some point I said, I really thought I had this figured out. He looked at me over his mug and said, You did figure it out. Just faster than you expected to. I think about that sentence a lot, more than almost anything else from that whole stretch of my life. Because he was right. I didn't fail to see who Constance Sorrell was. I saw it early, in a lunch that lasted 90 minutes, in a comment about resourcefulness, in a question about my parents that came 6 minutes into meeting me. I just gave her 5 months of the benefit of the doubt that she never once considered giving me. If there's anything I've taken from all of this, it's that the people who are quietly deciding what you're worth rarely announce it directly. They test the ground first with small comments dressed up as curiosity or concern. And by the time they say the real thing out loud, they've usually already decided how the story ends. I've also learned that composure is not the same thing as weakness. I never raised my voice in that ballroom, not once. And it was still the loudest thing I did all year. And I've learned that the people who show up in 36 minutes, in a sport coat over a flannel shirt, with a business attorney and a banker in tow, without ever once asking what happened before they started fixing it, are worth more than any name on a plaque in a country club lobby. If any part of this sounded familiar to you, if you've ever had someone decide who you were before they ever bothered to ask, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe, because there's more where this came from.
Thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.